Okay,
I was ready.
yes, our next presenter is Sara Thomas, and she will be discussing an interesting concept of non-native speech translation in a work Our Lady of Shipwreck, Fatima. So please, Sara.
Hello everyone. Once again, my name is Sara Thomas, and I worked on the translation of a short story which I ended up titling Fatima, Our Lady of the Shipwreck. And before, I didn't actually have the knowledge of the concept that Our Lady is a title that is used within the Catholic religion to represent, for example, Nuestra Senora, and it represents the Virgin Mary, or the figure within Catholicism. So that's just a little hint if you didn't already have that background knowledge. So I'll first go over a little bit about the author and the plot to the story. Our author is Lourdes Ortiz, and she is from Spain. She currently works at the University of Complutense in Madrid, and she's written many contemporary novels, essays, short stories, and she's also been very involved with well-known newspapers in Spain, writing newspaper articles. And I think one thing to note that distinguishes her is she usually writes about political or social issues, and she's been very involved and active within different movements within Spain, as you see the feminist movements, and she was in one of the movements to work against the Franco regime. And a lot of her stories in general have to do with social topics, repression, homosexuality, gender equality, and other issues. And I think this is also something that shows up. The story that I translated also has a social issue behind it, and I really feel like she shed light with the story on the struggles of immigration. So the plot for the story, the map gives a good kind of description here. You see how close Morocco is to Spain. There's really only about 12 miles in between this area here. And really, there is a lot of immigration from northern Africa up into Spain. And that's what this story's plot really is about. It's about Fatima, our protagonist, who is on one of these illegal immigrant rowboats, and the boat overturns. So she and one of the other characters in the stories are the only two that end up surviving the shipwreck. So she ends up here in Almeria in one of the villages outside of the main city of Almeria, and she's pretty much just paralyzed and stuck there on the shore because she lost her husband and her son when she was coming up, crossing over. So the story really shows, it's from the viewpoint of the village people in Almeria. So it's how they look at her and how they see her. Sometimes they treat her as an isolated or an alienated figure, but as the story goes on to develop, they actually show a great level of empathy for her, and also a great level of affection, and they actually convert her into a Virgin Mary figure, as she's also very much compared to the Virgin Mary figures in Spain. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the translation strategies that I used. I used a lot of different ones, but I'm specifically going to talk about these two. Foreignization, and I think I'm saying this right, Venuti's foreignization strategy. This story had so many cultural and country-specific elements that I felt like there were some things that needed to stay in Spanish while translating over. So I actually left proper names and food items in Spanish, even though I could find English equivalents that existed. And really, it's to transport the audience to the fixed place in Almeria, and it's just such a culturally bounded, restricted text that I felt like I needed to leave some of the Spanish items in Spanish. So I made use of foreignization, retaining information from the source text. And then I also made use of dynamic equivalence, which is really moving away from a literal word-for-word translation and trying to carry over sense for sense and meaning for meaning. So it's really about creating the same effect for your target audience as the same effect that your source audience would have, keeping a natural type syntax and expression within the target language. And so to go over a little bit, as I said before, Catholic symbolism shows up very often. It's one of the main themes in this story. And for the village people, Fatima actually comes to be very revered and venerated and looked at as one of the Virgin Mary figures. So she's compared to these different figures, and as a translator, I felt like I needed to go in and add footnotes for an American audience that likely wouldn't have that background relevant cultural knowledge. And so I acted as a mediator. So, for example, in the text, the translation would be Our Lady of Mount Carmel, but an American, maybe a non-Catholic person may not have that background knowledge to put that together, what that would actually mean, comparing Fatima to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So I went ahead and added in the footnote, is the patron saint of fishermen and mariners and the official patron saint of many coastal towns in Spain. So I think that was an addition that was justified on my part. And so now I get to the main translation challenge that I faced, which was the non-native speech of one of the other main protagonists in the story, which two survivors from the shipwreck. It was Fatima and Mohammed, and Mohammed actually has made his life in the village for a while, but he's the only other survivor from the shipwreck. And the village people interact with him often because they are trying to help Fatima, and they want him, if he goes up to her, maybe she'll recognize him and kind of get out of this state of shock that she's in, like she's paralyzed there on the beach. So they think if she sees him, she might jolt back to reality because he was on the boat with her. So his speech should be at a basic proficiency level. You'll see later on that the author actually gives him, it's not quite consistent, the proficiency level that she gives him. But I'll explain that later in the next slide. I thought with the non-native speech that to transfer it over into English, that I could, at first I just thought I could take certain errors from Spanish and just move them into English, but then I realized two languages are very structurally different, and that wasn't always going to be the case, that I was going to be able to move the exact error from Spanish to an equivalent in English. So I started to do more research. I knew I was going to have to look into, so Mohammed speaks Arabic, and I needed to look into what transfer errors would occur from him going from Arabic into English. So the transfer errors are, because the two languages are so structurally different, what kind of errors he would be carrying over into English. So I had to do a lot of research on that. I also had to do research in general on specific difficulties for second language English acquisition over the board in general. And I also spoke with Dr. Sara Felden here at Wake Forest, who had significant linguistical background for both Arabic and English. So why exactly did Muhammad's non-native speech have to be adjusted during the translation project? So I touched on number one a little bit earlier, but two languages that have very different structures, I couldn't transfer the exact error from Spanish over to English just because of the structural differences. And another big reason that I had to adjust the non-native speech for Muhammad was because the author didn't keep a consistent level throughout Muhammad's narratives in the text. So, for example, in the beginning, Muhammad had a very, very basic level, and he wasn't able to conjugate first-person present tense in Spanish. So he would say, yo hablar español instead of yo hablo español. So that was very, very basic. But then, later on in the story, the author kind of gave him the ability to distinguish between preterite and imperfect, and also gave him the ability to use subjunctive. So those, as you all know that have studied Spanish, are very difficult elements to acquire of Spanish. So here we see he used venía, which is imperfect, and no pudo, which is preterite. And then raro que mujer se salve would be subjunctive. So she did not keep a consistent proficiency level for Muhammad, and that I wanted to keep a consistent level. So that's also why I had to adjust his speech. And then another one of the main reasons that I needed to keep Muhammad's speech constant, his non-native speech constant throughout the text, was because at times the author wrote her dialogues a bit, it was confusing to tell who was speaking in the story. So by keeping Muhammad's level constant, it more defined his character, and it also assisted the audience in knowing, okay, now I know that Muhammad's speaking. And then these are some of the transfer errors that I found in my research from Arabic into English. And I won't read all of them for you, but the three that I was able to incorporate into my translation, for example, the word order for adjectives and adverbs are different in Arabic, so they go after the noun. So we would find errors such as beach is beautiful or rules very helpful. And then another example is that Arabic speakers don't make use of the copula in the present tense, so it's often dropped when they're transferring over into English. So we would find errors like she a nurse. And then they also have a lack of an indefinite article in Arabic, which I made sure to take out of Muhammad's speech. I also removed some of his definite articles as well, because that was a general difficulty for second language acquisition. And so this is just some segments of the non-native speech that I translated with its proper adjustments. And let's see, I'll read a few of these. So, wind bad, sea terrible, big waves, first rat boat and later turnboat. And chatting always, not stop talking. We are sick from much chatting and husband not trusting. Woman talks so much, woman to watch, and that would be woman to watch out for, be careful for. So what errors did I incorporate into his speech? Obviously we have incomplete sentences. I already kind of touched on the missing articles and the incorrect adjective placement. One other thing I wanted to do was give Muhammad a complete lack of past tense knowledge in English. So in order to do that, where it says, Fatima I know on boat is more young. If I had translated that literally from Spanish, because the author gave him past tense knowledge, it would have been Fatima I knew was more young. That would have been the literal translation. But I didn't want to give Muhammad the past tense knowledge, so I had to add in the part where we see on boat. I had to add that in so the audience would know right away that he was referring to a past experience, the shipwreck. And let's see, I didn't give him comparative ER endings, so we see more young instead of younger. And at some points I had to reduce the register, move a vocabulary word down a register. And I also took out, for example, his lack of knowledge with participle usage and that relative clauses. So those are some of the errors that I adjusted for within his speech. And the takeaway point that I got from this really was, in order to create an accurate non-native speech within literature, you really have to do a lot of background research into knowing what the native language is of your character, so you can use those transfer errors to create a more accurate non-native speech. And then with translating, it all just gets a lot more complicated. So it was a challenge, but it was good. I learned a lot. Any questions?
How did you choose the text?
I was looking for, as most of you know, I'm obsessed with Spain. I was looking for something contemporary Spain, and this actually was from the same region that I lived a few years ago. So, and I really liked all of the cultural elements involved in it. So that was where that came in.
Have you been on the beach in Almeria?
Yes, actually. I have.
On the same beach, right?
Yeah.
Shipwreck. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Great. Thank you very much. One more? Our next presenter will also be talking about language and ideologies, and it's Felicity Radway, and she'll be talking about preserving the ideology in one of their short stories by Bandera Hueca. By Victor Hugo Robles.
And it's actually not a short story. It's the first 3 chapters of the book.
Okay.
So as Dr. Ferneck mentioned, I'll be talking about a translation of Bandera Hueca and preserving the ideology of the author in this text. So the goal of my translation was to convey the ideology of the author faithfully. And the author is actually a gay man, so he was very involved in the LGBT movement in Chile. And so I wanted to be sure that the text showed either a neutral or positive attitude toward the queer community, because that would be representative of the author's views that he showed in the source text. And so I focused mainly on the vocabulary that the author used and how it reflected his vocabulary, although I also noticed other ways that the ideology was reflected in the text, including metaphors and intertextual references. And to decide how to translate the vocabulary used, I used a corpus-based study. So I evaluated the connotative and denotative meaning of the expressions used to refer to the LGBT community. And I tried to select terms that closely matched the connotations present in the source text. So why did I choose this text? Well, first, I thought it was of historical importance because the Pinochet regime, which is, this book explores the LGBT movement and how it survived the Pinochet regime and how queer people were treated under that regime. So it's of historical importance because it discusses human rights violations, and also the LGBT movement provoked rapid social change in both Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. So within a matter of 2 or 3 decades, we went from you could be put to death for being gay to gay marriage. And this content, I actually did a research paper in my undergrad, and I use this as one of my sources, but there's not a lot of content about queer people and how they were treated under these dictatorships in the Southern Cone. So translating a book like this would provide more content to English readers. And then also another important aspect is the visibility of the queer community, because although they were victims of the regime, they're often not discussed. The author, Victor Robles, actually discusses this, and he says they are not even registered in historical records that talk about the Pinochet regime. So even though they were victims, they are often ignored in history. So my research questions were basically, how is ideology conveyed through choice of vocabulary? So how do the words and expressions that the author uses reflect his ideology? How can queer vocabulary be translated without altering the ideology? So how do I choose expressions in English that have the same connotations? What are the differences between the connotations in Spanish and English? So even if there is an equivalent, like homosexual for homosexual, what is the difference in connotative meaning between Spanish and English? And finally, how else does the author express ideology? So like I mentioned, I also looked briefly at metaphors and intertextual references. So the two corpora that I used to do my research were COCA for English, because it's a corpus of contemporary American English. So because I was translating into American English, I wanted to focus only on American speech, because the terms, especially pejorative terms, are very different in English from the UK, from Australia, than they are in American English. And then corpus for Spanish, which corpus is actually Spanish from all over the world, but I specifically looked up in the subcorpus of Chilean Spanish, because the original text was from Chile and there were some words that were specific to Chile. And then I basically looked at the expressions that were used in the source text, and I determined their connotative meaning, and then I looked by looking at the context. So I looked at the most recent entries, and I read the context that appeared in the corpus and determined whether it was positive, neutral, or negative. And then I did the same for terms or expressions in English, and I also looked at the context to find matching terms and expressions that I could use. So I gave examples there, you can read them, of what positive, neutral, and negative context would look like. So positive context would clearly show that the speaker or writer had positive views in relation to the LGBT community. Neutral, the views of the author could not be determined, so it was mostly academic or sometimes news articles. And then negative, clearly a negative opinion. And then translating the vocabulary. So the original text, as I mentioned before, had mostly a neutral or positive connotation, which reflected the views of the author. And there were language differences, so I found for many of the terms, the easiest go-to translation had a different connotative meaning, so I had to find an equivalent expression that more closely matched the meaning. And then some of this is cut off, but one of the most interesting things as I was doing my research, I found that even even the dictionary definition of a word, so even two words that might have the same dictionary definition, they can have different meanings because of their connotation. But I also found that the dictionary in some cases does reflect the connotation of the word. Now, dictionaries generally are supposed to be neutral, but in many cases they differentiate, they show the views of the author in the differences between how they approached homosexuality and heterosexuality. So dictionaries, for example, might describe homosexuality as an instinct or tendency, while they would describe heterosexuality as a feeling or behavior. So that kind of reveals the ideology of the author or publisher of the dictionary. And dictionaries may also reflect the views of society as a whole, so not just the individual author. So this dictionary from Diccionario del Uso del Español from 1966 defined homosexuality as the vice of the homosexuals. So clearly that reflected the attitudes of society in the 1960s. And if you looked at a dictionary that said that now, that would seem very biased. And then I also looked at pejorative language, because this book provides many personal accounts, and the speakers would recount stories of being harassed and being called these pejorative names. So I had to try to find equivalent expressions in English, because many, for example, mariposa, literally it means butterfly, but we don't use that as an insult in English for queer people. So I had to find equivalent expressions that would be used in English, and often the word would have a double meaning. Like, for example, the word sissy has kind of a double meaning of someone who is weak, but it can also be used for gay people. So if there was a double meaning in the source text, I tried to find a word in English that also had a similar double meaning. And so here are the translations I selected. And as you can see, some of them I did not use like the literal translation. So homosexual, I didn't use homosexual because it has a more negative connotation in English. I used gay instead. But some of them I was able to translate more literally. So lesbiana, lesbian. And then the other translation issues I looked at, metaphors. So the title of the book, Bandera Hueca, the author actually in Congress presented a flag with a hole in the center, representing the empty space occupied by marginalized groups in society. And so I wanted to choose a word for hueca, which can mean, it can mean empty or hollow, or I wanted to choose something that conveyed the double meaning of both the hole in the flag and also this empty space. So that's why I chose hollow. And then El Che de los Gays, the Victor Hugo described himself as the Che of the gays because he was a leader in the LGBT movement. And then finally, intertextual references. This was a difficult problem to deal with, and Dr. Boris and I discussed it many times. But the author actually attributed this quote, "The love that dare not speak its name," to Oscar Wilde. And the original author of this quote was Oscar Wilde's lover, Sir Alfred Douglas. And in order to, I wanted to preserve the attribution to Oscar Wilde because it referred to Oscar Wilde's elaborated description of the meaning of this quote when he was tried for homosexuality, which was a crime at that time. but I also wanted to give credit to the original author of the quote. So I cited it as, I said, Sir Alfred Douglas as cited by Oscar Wilde. So, and then finally, implications for future research. I thought that this research could be relevant for evaluating vocabulary in other texts. So a similar corpus-based study could be used to determine whether a text is neutral or biased, to determine whether expressions that are used are appropriate for the register. So if an expression or word has a strong negative or positive connotation, it may not be appropriate for an academic text. And then also determining which expressions are appropriate to use in other translations. And then it could also be used to compare queer vocabulary across languages. So I looked at Spanish, but what about Italian or Japanese or French? Would the different languages use different vocabulary, and what would the connotations look like in different languages? And then finally, I thought because I noticed these other metaphors and intertextual references, those could be explored in more depth. Yes.
How much of an issue did you run into finding words with double meanings? Because I've found that looking into what makes a word taboo is often difficult, if not entirely impossible. So how did you find words that had that same connotation, for lack of a better term?
A lot of times it was very difficult because I actually found fewer words in English than I did in Spanish. And sometimes I had to use the same word twice. But I did a lot of research. I researched the histories of the words. So I looked not just at like the current use, but like why people started using that word. Any other questions?
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. And this concludes our first session, and we would like to invite you for a cup of tea or coffee, and we'll come back in about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Yeah, so we are a little bit earlier, so I have more time, shall we? As a matter of fact. Let's meet here in 10 minutes. 25 to 4.
We get to